People will often ask me, usually out of some kind of exasperation, what's God's will for my life? And that tells me a lot right there in terms of discerning God's will, and that's a lifelong pursuit of discerning God's will. And it helps me to realize that person is often thinking that there's one big will of God for their lives, and there isn't. Our lives are not one-dimensional. Our lives are compartmentalized. There's so many different pieces of our life, and you can be in God's will in one area and not be in God's will in another area. For example, you could seek God and try to hear from the Lord about who to marry, but not do that to a car that you want to buy, and end up with a good marriage but driving a lemon. And at the same time, if you seek the Lord about the kind of car you should buy but not who you should marry, it makes for a very long trip in the car. You could be in the right car with the wrong marriage. You don't want that. That'd be a bummer. There's so many different parts of our lives, and our life is not one big chunk of something. So when someone says, what's God's will for my life, that's like asking, why is the sky blue? Or how is it blue? It's just too big of a question. You have to break it down into parts, compartments. So where you're going to go and what you're going to be doing, you seek the Lord, you submit to Him, and He leads you into His will, into His pleasure in that area, which is fulfilling for you because your pleasure is directly linked to His pleasure. If you're doing what doesn't please the Lord, you'll never be happy. You'll never feel fulfilled. So there's that. And then there's what I call God's ultimate will and God's immediate will. So His ultimate will is the Bible. His ultimate will is everything that He wrote in the Bible. And so there's lots of stuff that He says, this is what pleases me, that you never have to pray about. You never have to pray about tithing because He wrote and said, this is what pleases me, that I want you to take your first fruits of everything that I give you and turn it back to Him. We know that 10% pleased the Lord in the Old Testament, so I don't even have to pray about whether not to give 10% because He's already said that. So the question for me is, how much more do I give than 10%? And how do I give that? And then we find, in Malachi that he was displeased with those people of that generation because they refused to tithe. And so we see His pleasure is already linked to that. So it's not even something I pray about. It's not something I wonder week by week whether or not I'll tithe. I decided to tithe in 1978, and I've never prayed about it since or thought about it since. It's automatic. It's an automatic deduction. I've never had to go back and revisit that since 1978 because it was God's will. It's how I see God's will. And not everybody sees it the same, of course, but that's how I see it. That's how I read the Bible. It's God's will to heal the sick because Jesus was whipped alive with a cat o' nine tails, flailed alive, to procure healing for all people everywhere for all time. How to break that down into the immediate, how to get that healing into me for the immediate, that takes seeking and saying, that's your will. How do I get that? That's your ultimate will, but how do I get that in my immediate life? That's a struggle, and that's something you're going to have to pray through and grapple with and try to find. And so you got this tension between His ultimate will and His immediate will. Like, for example, another thing about His ultimate will, I've had young people come and say, I found this man that I want to be with and I want to marry, and I'll say, is he a believer? And they'll say, no. But he will be, when I get through with him, kind of thing. Well, that's not something you have to pray about, because God's ultimate will, his word, says that believers are not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. It's not even a question. It's not even something you have to pray about. We know clearly what pleases him in that area, because he's already said. So there's so much that we need to know the Bible, because that helps us understand God's ultimate will. And there are people who dismiss the Old Testament, but I'll tell you how I see it. Most of the moral laws, in fact, let me say it this way, all of the moral laws are transferred into the New Testament and restated in the New Testament by apostles who wrote epistles. We don't have to dismiss the Old Testament. Most of it has been transferred. The parts that haven't been transferred are the priestly laws of sacrifice and new moons and special days and special holidays. That part's not been transferred. It's not been restated in the New Testament. But a lot of it has. And so I've met people who just totally dismiss the Old Testament as irrelevant. They do that to their own hurt. They don't realize how you can't really even fully appreciate or understand the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament. The Old Testament is our commentary for the New Testament. It's the genesis of everything that we believe now as believers. The genesis of that belief is somewhere in the Old Testament. We have to understand it. But it's not God's will for our life in a complete way, that we take everything that's said in the Old Testament and apply it. For example, in the Old Testament, they had multiple wives. In the New Testament, he says, let him be the husband of one wife. And so we don't have multiple wives like David did, because it's been tweaked in the New Testament. And there's lots of things that Jesus upped in the New Testament, where he said, okay, you've heard it said, this is how we've always believed it, but here's what I'm requiring of you. And he took it to a different level. And so we have to understand God's general will, his ultimate will, by really trying to understand the Bible. And that's a lifelong pursuit. That's not a 3-month kind of thing, as you know. That's a lifetime of trying to understand God's will in a general sense, in an ultimate sense, to apply it to my life. And but then there's his specific will. So I'll give you an example of that. I had I've always sought the Lord about cars that I should buy and which ones, and it started because we had no money. We just had no money at all, and one of the very first miracles I ever experienced in answer to prayer was I prayed and God gave me a car, and that was a real test, like a real challenge for me. We had no money, and Heather's car started smoking. I had stopped smoking, but now the car is smoking. And she's pregnant with our first child, and she's walking to work because the car console caught on fire one day, and that was the end of that little buggy. And so I began believing God and praying for a car, and I felt that he wanted to give me one, not borrow money to buy one. And we had no money, we had no credit, we're newlyweds and just starting out. And so for a number of weeks, that was a huge thing for me, to ask God for a car and believe him for it. And he gave me the keys to a car. And so everything from that time on, that became my mode of always praying for a car. And so one of the most recent cars that I had, I remember we had a big van, because we had lots of grandkids, and we're hauling them places and that kind of thing. It was a kind of a grandpa's car. It had sliding doors, and it was a nice old van, but it got used up. And now the dilemma was, do I buy another honking big vehicle? Gas prices were high. Or do I buy some kind of little economy buggy that's just big enough for me to get around for my trips? and I'm getting older. Do I want a little economy car for long trips, or do you want something a little more comfortable? And we're still living in a snow region, so get something with 4-wheel drive. And so but I didn't know. I mean, as the more I thought about it, the less I realized, or the less sure I was. What kind of car do I get? Do I get a little economy car? Do I get another big van? And I couldn't decide. And so I prayed and I said, Lord, I can't decide, but you know the future. You know what I need. You know what I should get. Choose for me the car I should get. And that brought a lot of peace to my heart. And now I'm just waiting to see how he's going to reveal it to me, how he's going to show me. And I was driving down the highway one day, wasn't even thinking about this prayer that I had prayed. But as I was driving down this throughway, this car pulled on alongside me and hung right in front of me, just in the other lane, but right in front of me. And as I sat there, I looked at it, and I had never noticed this car before. I don't remember ever seeing one before. It wasn't like I was car crazy or thinking about cars or anything like that. But that car hung there for the longest time, and as I got looking at it, I saw on the back it said 4-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. And I thought, it's not a big van, and it's not an economy car. It's kind of in the middle. It's a kind of a crossover car. And I got looking at it, and I said, Lord, I think that's the kind of car I want right there. And I just said, that's the car I'll take. And in a week, I was driving a car just like that. And it just all played out. Once I saw the car, and then Nelson started helping me and looking, and we found one, and that was a great car. It didn't cost us anything to keep it on the road. It was just a great car. It was like handpicked from the Lord for us, and that was that whole process of there's nothing in the car and nothing in the Bible about buying Toyota or a Beamer, or it doesn't mention anything about that, because it just talks about his general will of wanting to provide for us. And so now I need to get out of thinking about his ultimate will and get into his specific will, and his specific will comes out of relationship. Can you see it? We're talking about two aspects of God's will, his ultimate will and his immediate will. And it's his immediate will that we struggle with the most, because his ultimate will is so clear. It's what the scripture says, and that we don't have to even wonder about. We take it by heart. We take it to heart. We take it sincerely, and we sincerely submit to it. Amen?